Hey, what's up, guys? Today we are talking about one of the most special games in the East series, at least in my heart. I've always been a huge fan of East 7 since I played it in 2022. It was my first East game, and without beating around the bush, it left a solid impression. But nowadays, with quite a few of these games off of my backlog, I think it's appropriate to replay East 7 and see how strongly it compares to the long lineup of amazing games from the series. I've got faith in East 7 here. I think it's a great game. I'll get that right off the bat. And I think it will hold its own against some of the other games here. But I guess we'll just have to find out. Oh, and before we start, no spoilers for most of the review. You guys get it by now. Blah, blah, blah. No spoilers, but we'll cover the basics of the narrative. East 7 really feels like a landmark adventure for our series protagonist, Adol Kristen, with him and his friend Dogi finally able to travel to the Kingdom of Altago. During a long war with the Roman Empire, yeah, the Roman Empire, spelled like this, the two nations agree on a temporary ceasefire which opens up the sea for travelers to sail freely between the two. But we need to take a pause here because now we are greeted by one of the best goddamn video game intros of all time. I'll say it right now. The first few seconds are almost normal, and then anyway, Adol and Dogi, they safely dock in Altago. Yes, I just said that. I said safely dock. The boat didn't implode this time. And the two begin looking around the sprawling capital city. The duo stumble across this little girl tries to sell Adol a flower. This girl, her name is Maya. She also appears to be mute, aka she can't talk. This flower business is run by another woman, Tia, and she finds herself in a little bit of hot water when this dude named Commander Rod tries out his dating skills. But it doesn't go well, as Mr. Rod he just removes the word no from his vocabulary, and that causes a little bit of a scene which Adol and Dogi stumble across, and they try to intervene, and that lands them in prison. So, GG's there, guys. But their stay in the Slammer is pretty short-lived, as another commander for the Dragon Knights, Skyus, he informs the two that the King of Altago himself wishes to meet with them. The king happens to know of Adol's other travels around the world, which, by the way, that's really cool. It makes sense that word would get around of the crazy shit that Adol got into in the previous games. Anyway, Adol and Dogi are asked to travel to this nearby cave/shrine, which was uncovered during a recent earthquake, with the king believing that there is something special about this place. And that's where our adventure begins. Obviously, there's a lot more to the story, which kind of unravels slowly at first, but then it picks up in the second half. So about the narrative, I think my favorite part of it was probably the characters, as there are some pretty memorable ones in here. Dogi, he gets the largest spotlight I think he's ever received in this series. He's here for the entire adventure. And Dogi isn't the only returning character here in East 7, as Geis comes back from East 6. I said he was more interesting in 6 than he is in 7, and I stick by that, but yeah, I mean, I still love his inclusion in the game, and I enjoyed how his character progresses through East 6 and 7, as after 6, he's maybe a little bit more humble and respectful towards Adol, but he still kind of retains that badass characteristic of him. The original characters are also pretty good. I think Aisha and Tia were my favorites. Tia is just a great supporting character. She makes regular appearances throughout the adventure, helping Adol and Dogi and vice versa. And Aisha is kind of the rich brat who has her heart turned kind through the events of the story. In many ways, it shares parallels with Laxia from Ys 8. But I always thought they did a better job with Aisha's arc, because the personality shift felt so much more natural here, and her character gets put through many interesting scenarios, especially in the second half of the game. And the rest of the cast were fine. They weren't bad. Ys 7 has a fucking enormous cast of characters, so it makes sense that some of them might not be developed enough, but they're all pretty likable, and that's all I can really ask for. There is this one character, Elk, kind of got under my skin in the beginning portion of the game, but afterwards it's all sunshine and rainbows, so like I said, they're all pretty decent. And the core story is pretty well done. Little complaints there, I don't really have much to rant about, especially since a lot of it would be going into spoilers. But some of the twists and turns will have you quite invested in what's going to happen next. And finally, I feel obliged to mention the villain. I can't say much, actually no, I can't say anything about them, but you want to know going in that this is the best villain in the entire series by far. At least from what I've played, absolutely. Great villain, stellar villain, one of the best characters in the series. Love the villain in this game. Another thing that I really appreciated about Ys 7, and really this series as a whole, is the small reward that you get for playing the other games, in the form of references and world building that subtly tie the world of Ys together. And I think Ys 7 does this immaculately, but it's still a newcomer-friendly game and self-contained. By this point, Adol has quite a number of wild adventures under his belt, and they are noticed by prominent figures in the world. Like I mentioned, the king picked up on some of this and knows who Adol is. And I really got that feeling like Ys 7, it's almost like, a lot of ways, like a love letter to previous games with all of these references. It's just like embracing what came before. It feels like all of these games are just one long TV series that brings a creative spin on the established greatness, while not straying too far from what makes them all great in the first place. And Ys 7's new spin isn't just on the narrative level, but in the gameplay form as well. As stated before, Ys 7 was my first Ys game. The intro might have piqued my interest, but the first 15 minutes of gameplay in Altago Field just sold me. It took me all of 2 minutes to just stop playing and think to myself, this game is already really fun. Like, just look at me and the boys decimating scores of local wildlife. How can that not be fun? And the first boss fight is just absolutely nuts. I mean, just look at this. For a first boss, yeah, wow. But as I said before, Ys 7 brings a new spin on the Ys formula, as this was the first game to feature the party system where you could play as more characters than just Adol. And there is a bunch of them. You can play as it feels like 10 different characters. And you know who's playable? Alright, I'm gonna need you guys to calm down here. You can play as Dogi. That's right, we can finally play as Dogi. It only took 7 entries, and it's the first and only time. But he's still cool as fuck in this game.
A little bit of punching, what? And a little bit of ass whooping, what?
Ys 7 was also the first Ys game to feature the skill system, which we mentioned back when I reviewed Ys 8. And to use these skills, you need to collect SP, which you can get by charge attacking enemies, killing enemies, just attacking in general. There are plenty of ways to get it. And once you do build up that meter, some of these attacks later on in the game are really crazy. I forgot just how crazy some of these skills are later in the game. On top of these skills, you can also unleash a extra skill, which takes a while to build up, but once it does, you can get some crazy damage out of it, and each character has their own unique set of skills and extra skill. One of the ways that I didn't mention to build up the extra gauge and the SP bar is something called the Flash Guard, another mechanic that makes its debut here in E7. And it's mostly the same as it is in future entries, albeit a little less polished. For example, you get very little iframes when using the Flash Guard, so when you get hit by a projectile that lasts a long time, what do you do to get out of it? Well, you have to mash the button, which is actually really overpowered and can build up your SP and extra meter like crazy. But hey, if it taught me anything, I'm now convinced I can Flash Guard through an EF5 tornado. Another change that E7 made to the formula, I'm saying this line a lot, but anyway, the boss fights were changed a lot, and they just go nuts sometimes. Some of these boss fights are crazy, but not only that, they are incredibly long sometimes. For some of them, I didn't really seem to notice, as they just cut short of being tedious and annoying, but there are others, like this flying bird thing. Oh my god, man, it took me almost 15 minutes to beat this guy, and that's just too long. And the boss fights aren't too hard, but there is one that definitely got me quite a number of times, and that is this moon dragon thing, which its final phase is just, it's too hard to dodge some of these attacks, so I was getting my ass whooped. And each time, it would take me almost 10 minutes to get back where I was. So they're a little bit too long for my taste. Like, can you imagine if any of the boss fights in E7 were as hard as they are in, like, E6 or Oath in Felghana? It would be a nightmare. But in general, E7's combat is pretty good. I really like this game's combat. I like the skills and the amount of variety you have with the amount of characters, and they each do so many different things and so many different attacks. It keeps things very fresh for its almost 30-hour runtime, and it has kind of an interesting feel compared to the other games. It uses more like hit-and-run tactics, especially with the bosses, where you wait for them to do something and then you run in and just unleash a flurry of combos and then just get out of there. And the dashes are so fast. You can go full screen with some of these goddamn dashes. They are lightning quick. So as a result, the boss fights are faster and they launch more projectiles because they take into account your party's speed. So it feels a lot more frantic and fast than a lot of the other games in the series. But ultimately, it lacks a little bit of polish. If I had any other complaints, there is a grind at the end of the game. If you want to get the best weapons and armor in E7, you have to harvest these materials and make them yourself. And just making one of these things, they command an outrageous number of them. So much that you'll be sitting there for a few hours just gathering materials. It's just too much. It's too grindy at the end. I think they should have trimmed down the material cost for some of these things. And finally, if you're wondering what difficulty to play E7 on, I would recommend hard mode or even nightmare, because normal mode is extremely easy. That's what I did on my first playthrough, and I seriously died only a couple of times throughout a 30-hour game. On nightmare, I died quite a few times. It still wasn't a really tough game by any means, but there are some kind of tricky moments in boss fights which might require you to pay attention and use the flash guard, so I recommend checking out the higher difficulties if that's your thing. There's one more thing I wanted to mention on the gameplay side of E7, and that is the dungeons. And I really like these ones. I really like the dungeons in this game. Each one brings a pretty simple mechanic that just mixes things up on the exploration side and keeps you engaged. They're just open enough to let you look around the place, but doesn't have you feeling hopelessly lost. Just for those who didn't like that aspect in Ys 1 and 2. Not only that, but some of these places just look so fucking dope. Seriously, some of the coolest locales are here in Ys 7. Just look at how incredible the wind towers are in Kilos, or the Earth Sanctum later in the game, or that starlit sky in Iska Village. It looks great, especially for a PSP game. This might be the most geographically diverse place that Adol has ever explored. Okay, we are going to get into spoiler territory now. That's right, if you haven't played Ys 7, I'll leave a timestamp so you can skip the spoilers. Let's get into it. So the big evil in Ys 7 is that of the Wind of Destruction. To my knowledge, it's sort of a factory reset for all of Altago. If the land becomes imbalanced, the Elder of Iska will harvest the souls of all of the dead and the despair of the people to summon the end of Altago, which is Rule End. That's the name of the creature or whatever. The only challenger to this cycle is that of a selected dragon warrior who seeks the 5 dragons of Altago to theoretically stop the Wind of Destruction. The only problem with this is that none of them, actually 0 of them, managed to pull it off. And I think this is a really cool concept, as the Destined Warrior usually saves the day, but what if it served the purpose of being the final nail in the coffin for the last remaining hope of the people, you know? That final bit of despair to bring Altago to an end. So Adol happens to be the selected dragon warrior this time. Notice how I mentioned there's someone needed to bring about this Wind of Destruction? Tia is this person. Yeah, Tia is the antagonist, along with Skyus from earlier. Skyus seemed a little bit sketchy, to be fair, but Tia, honest to God, was dead last for villain candidate in my head. I'd believe fucking Dogi being the villain over Tia, honestly. It was a real, wow, just holy crap kind of moment. Not only that, but Skyus, Bess, Adol, Dogi, and Geis in combat. A 3-on-1 with some real tough motherfuckers. And Skyus doesn't just win. He came out like your dad with the belt and whooped our asses. And keep in mind, this isn't just everyday Adol either. This is late Ys series Adol, post Ys 8 Adol. So with the destiny of the Dragon Warrior being to lose, and Skyus utterly destroying us, this is the only time in the series where the optimistic view starts to fade. And this is the only time I didn't have complete faith in Adol being able to save the day. But that's great. Honestly, I really like that aspect about Ys 7's narrative. And the answer to our success lies in the ending. And how did they do here? Near the end, the Well of Souls opens up. The end of Altago is drawing near. But we know by now, Adol is not one to back down, even after complete defeat. So we go into the well and confront Skyus again. And this time, it's our turn to pass over the humble pie. Not just defeating Skyus, but straight up killing him. He at least apologizes for the trouble he caused, and for framing Adol for the king's death. But now it's time for the finale, meeting up with Tia Luna, antagonist of E7, and the kind of unlucky inheritor of the fate of Altago. I mean, really, she only decided to reset the place after Maya caught Iskin fever, which is an incurable product of the imbalance of Altago. And I really liked how they handled Tia's character here. It's not a good person turned bad, or an evil person that was pretending to be good. It's a good person feeling forced to do evil on the promise of ending a kind of prolonged suffering in Altago. The chilled out, friendly Tia from the early game wasn't just an act, and after we do defeat her, she does actually root for us to stop the entire cycle of imbalance in Altago. So the fight is taken all the way up to the Catalyst, Rule End, the Root of Existence, and the final boss of E7. My god, this is a pretty crazy boss battle, and actually one of my favorites. It forces you to make good use of all of your party members, with Adol taking on the final phase solo. It's epic, it's frantic, it's hype as hell, and of course Adol strikes the final blow, freeing Altago from the curse of the Wind of Destruction. You know, I've said this before, but Ys games typically don't have 100% happy endings, and E7 is definitely on that list. According to Tia, she is tied inexorably to the root of existence, and now that there is no more root, well, you can fear the worst. So Tia begins to fade from reality, but is reunited at least with Maya one more time, and Maya actually speaks for the first time as she begs her not to leave. But Tia's fate is inevitable, and she dies. Adol sticks around in Altago for a bit to help rebuild and all that jazz, but that desire for adventure hits, and he departs with Dogi shortly after, setting off to the events of Ys 9. What a closer! It was very surprising and super sad, but leaves you relatively hopeful for the rest of the cast. And it did genuinely hit me in the feels, really. I felt my eyes actually watering up. It's really dark and kind of emotional to see a kid be put in that situation. It's really bold for an Ys game, and just fantastic. Really, all I can say is just bravo, guys. Bravo. And that's Ys 7, a behemoth in not only the Ys series, but for really any action RPG. The gameplay is fast and responsive. It's not quite as polished as some of the other Ys games. There is, that certain level of jank to the flash guard, and there's some kind of bad AI in there, where I swear my party just straight up wasn't attacking some enemies at times. It was kind of jank. And they really needed to trim down some of the boss fights. They're just too long at times. So overall, E7 is a solid game. It's still a standout for me personally. It doesn't have any major weaknesses. The story is good, the game is fun as fuck, and as I said for Ys 8, E7 also doesn't drop the ball on anything. I don't think I could choose any other game to close this sort of mid-season finale for this marathon. Adol Kristen's line of fantastical journeys span far and wide, and I've never been more ready to see what lies next. For the Altago archives, however, my final rating is 8.5. Make sure to play E7 if you like video games. Yeah, it's that good. If you just like video games, play it. Anyway, thank you to everyone who has been here for the entire marathon thus far. I love you, I appreciate you, and I'll see you again with more Ys in the summer. But for now, we'll head back to regular variety videos. Take care, guys.